Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, welcome to the show. Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. With Anzac Day approaching confirmation today, it's now squarely on the activist hit list, with a group of teachers actually trying to link the Anzac legend to the current war in Gaza. Now I'll play you some extraordinary claims of conspiracies from their spokeswoman today. When the Prime Minister scrapped the cashless welfare card, violence and dysfunction returned to many regional communities. We'll cross live to Jacinta Nampijinpa Price tonight, who is visiting people impacted by this policy failure, who desperately want Canberra to understand the harm this has caused. Plus, Chris Ullman joins me to explain why the Bondi stabbings have been caught up in a sinister campaign of information warfare that's being condoned by the Russian government. And 4 years after commissioning a report into a second injecting room for Melbourne, the Allen government today finally announced it won't go ahead. Or will it? This backdown shows why community pressure is important and why we must keep it up.
The location needed to balance the needs of people who use drugs with the needs of the broader CBD community.
But first, I noted in my Sunday column that the culture warriors and those who hate our country and our way of life would come for Anzac Day next. Well, today they did. Pippa Tandy is her name. She's the convener of Teachers for Palestine and herself a Victorian secondary school teacher. Well, she had a ding-dong argument with Melbourne radio host Tom Elliott, claiming that Australia Day celebrated war, it exploited children, and shouldn't be taught or commemorated the way it still is.
And it's being used for ideological purposes. It's not simply remembering sacrifices. A lot of people have contacted us. We're in connection with hundreds and hundreds of teachers, and not just in Victoria, but across Australia, who say, please help us. We are sick of this, having to do this ideological work for arms companies and the government.
Quite apart from my horror that anyone that historically ignorant is anywhere near a classroom, was my anger that we now have a movement of hard-left activists who want to do to Anzac Day what they've in part succeeded to do to Australia Day, to tear down the national symbols that unite us, to make us feel shame about our history, and in part perpetuate the myth that it's white, colonial and male, as most of our soldiers have been, or certainly those in the First and Second World Wars, or they're automatically undeserving of any commemoration, despite the fact that we wouldn't be free if it were not for their valour. So if you thought that on Thursday, on Anzac Day, you meant to pause for a moment to honour our war dead, to give thanks for their sacrifice and to cherish those freedoms that they'd fought for, well, you'd be wrong. Apparently, so say these teachers, and it's all tied up, they say, with arms dealers. And then this rubbish too.
The Anzac troops in the Middle East were actually involved in basically a European project to break up parts of the Arab territories, to divide them up among European states, and part of that involved clearing Palestinians out of the area.
Wrong. The Anzacs, mostly the light horse, whose famous charge at Beersheba was the last major mounted attack in history, were clearing out the Ottoman armies and liberating the Arabs, for that's what they were known for in those days, not Palestinians, from forcible inclusion in the then corrupt and incompetent Ottoman Empire. Now, this teacher tried to claim too that World War I was an imperialist war. Well, it was fought between empires, but one of them was the British Empire, the empire that stamped out slavery, fought and defeated German militarism and then defeated German Nazism, and also gave birth to the most free, fair and prosperous societies on earth, including Australia. The teacher, Pippa Tandy, was especially down on the British Empire, but Elliott, to his credit, took her on.
Well, I'd say that the British Empire is not a noble cause.
Sorry, you wouldn't be here without the British Empire.
Precisely. Of course I wouldn't. What does that mean?
Well, but if you hate it so much, why not leave? I mean, if it's such an ignoble
Don't tell me
cause.
I hate it so much, okay?
And yes, there was a massacre at Surafend in modern-day Israel when some New Zealand, Australian and British soldiers killed upwards of 40 local Arabs after one of their own had been murdered, after which compensation was paid to rebuild the village. But this argument wasn't just about history 100 years back. This was all about claiming that Australia and the Anzacs are somehow to blame for today's horrors in Gaza. The genocide in Palestine today, said the teacher, is all part of the same imperial push. So British Empire equals Anzacs equals imperialism equals genocide. And this presumably is the kind of historically ignorant, prejudiced brainwashing that teachers for Palestine are inflicting on our kids. Is it any wonder that our social cohesion's under strain and that anti-Semitism is rife on the streets if our kids are being force-fed this diet of falsehoods? On top of climate change alarmism, on top of gender confusion, with our teachers more focused now on pronouns in the periodic table, our slump in international rankings, we can see why. But don't think that ambivalence towards Anzac Day is confined to the left-wing fringes of the Teachers' Union. The Morrison government's rule that public servants had to take our national holidays, well, that's been changed. The Albanese government now allows public servants with ideological objections to public holidays associated with our national symbols, like Australia Day, like Anzac Day, like the King's birthday, to work instead and then take another day off in lieu. As Shadow Veterans Affairs Minister Barnaby Joyce, who'll join me shortly, says, this is a deliberate attempt to dilute the importance of Anzac Day. And it is, from a government that's running down our armed forces at exactly the time they need to be built up. And this is why the days we commemorate, the days we celebrate, the flags our leaders choose to stand behind matter as much as they do. Now look, here is something happening quietly by stealth that you need to really understand, because this will soon be rolled out right across every state and buried at all levels of government. And Labor's hope is that you won't notice it all until it's too late. Because while Victorians, along with 61% of all Australians, voted no to the voice, the Victorian Labor government is pushing on with a race-based separatist agenda as if the referendum had never been defeated. As revealed in this document I was passed today, the Allen government believes that Aboriginal Victorians have been shut out of independence and prosperity, so it's proposing to remedy this by returning to them a portion of the $1 billion plus that Victoria has gained in mineral royalties over the past decade. Here are the words of Victorian Energy Minister Lily D'Ambrosio. My intention, she says, is to embed within a critical mineral strategy the concept of traditional owner benefit sharing. Now, nothing about working for a living like everyone else has to. This is benefit sharing. We have to acknowledge, she went on, that traditional First Peoples cannot possibly be able to be secure what self-determination means for them without having an embedded and reliable source of revenue for themselves, ultimately through treaty. Now, this would be voice treaty truth, the whole Uluru agenda that voters overwhelmingly rejected, but that the Green Left and the Albanese government remains committed to. She said that the mining resources and the royalties that state governments had collected had played a significant role in, and I quote, perpetuating land injustice against First Peoples. Let's call this leftist myth-making for what it is, blatant double-dipping on behalf of Aboriginal people who first benefit from the economic opportunities and tax revenues that we all do, from the benefit of mining in the general budget. But then if the Victorian government goes ahead with this race-based favouritism, well, they'd all get a second go through a special allocation of money to Indigenous Victorians only. And it's this bit from the minister that's the kicker. This is the so-called benefit sharing. It may include financial payments from proponents of new major transmission projects, as well as co-ownership, procurement, employment and training opportunities. Last week, the Cumberland Shire Council in New South Wales almost passed a treaty of a sort that ratepayers knew very little about, and it was only because a councillor, Steve Christou, blew the whistle that they were stopped.
It's a comprehensive document prepared by lawyers. It states from the outset it is a treaty. It was brought to council with no briefing to the councillors, no legal representations of whatsoever.
They couldn't win the support of Australians for the divisive, race-based separatist agenda fair and square. So now at state and local government levels, there's a real push to do it anyway, but do it in a way they hope you will never notice. This is why tonight I want to make sure you do. All right, let's head to camera now for the headlines. Sky News political reporter Olivia Casely.
Elon Musk has mocked Anthony Albanese's social media crackdown, hours after his platform was ordered to remove graphic content of a stabbing at a Sydney church. A snap federal court hearing on Monday night saw X hit with a 2-day injunction to hide posts containing footage of the alleged stabbing of Bishop Marie Emmanuel.
This bloke thinks he's above everyone. Well, that's not the way that Australia operates.
But the request saw the billionaire staring down the demands, claiming X would stand for free speech and truth.
The Albanese government needs to look at what other powers are necessary and what enforcement is necessary and to get social media companies to take notice and to behave like decent, moral citizens rather than outliers who are allowing all sorts of material to propagate.
I'll be switching off X today. I'll be doing that before I get to the airport this afternoon, and I suggest that the other 226, there's 227 members of parliament do the same thing and show them that you mean business, because when you want to lead by example, it has to happen from here.
The Albanese government has blamed social media posts for inflaming community tensions in multicultural Sydney. Network 10 has argued Bruce Lerman should pay all of its costs in his failed defamation case against them. The network's defence of truth was upheld by Justice Michael Lee in a historic judgment that found, on the balance of probabilities, Lerman raped Brittany Higgins in Parliament House in March 2019. They argue he was quote-unquote deliberately wicked and calculated in bringing on the case and rejected an early offer to walk away from the proceedings. Mr Lerman has pleaded with the federal court to pay only a proportion of those costs. The details will be discussed at a hearing on May 1. Olivia Casely, Sky News, Canberra.
All right, let's get into the issues now. Sky News political editor Andrew Clennell joins me as he does every Tuesday. Let's start, if we can, Andrew, with that fight between the Australian government, but actually particularly the Prime Minister and X. Obviously now it's X, not Twitter, but I still refer to it as Twitter. Last night, the E-Safety Commissioner won that emergency injunction in the federal court. They were told to remove these videos. This is obviously the video only, though, of the terror attack at the Western Sydney Church. It's not any of the videos from hate preachers and all the anti-Semitic stuff out there on the internet, just this issue. How's this going? What do you think? Who's winning this fight, Elon Musk or the Prime Minister?
Well, I don't think anyone's winning it at the moment. I think it'll be legal action that stretches for months. And it's interesting because what we're talking about here isn't freedom of speech, with this particular video at least. We're talking about what you wouldn't be allowed to show on Sky News, on commercial television, extreme violence. And we saw after this Wakely attack followed the Bondi Junction attack, this sort of thing can lead to copycats. So some people, including Elon Musk, are trying to say this is a freedom of speech issue. I don't believe it is. But I think Meta and other organisations are cooperating with government agencies on this sort of stuff. Elon Musk has made it clear he's not going to. Where does this end? It ends in more laws seeking to police X. It could lead to, if X or Twitter don't obey court rulings, which I think they'll end up doing, it could lead to them being banned from Australia. So I think this has a long way to play out, Peter.
What about the image we often show them on Sky? I mean, pictures coming out of Alice Springs, violence on the streets, home evasions in Melbourne, where people have given us their own homes, CCTV footage. We can see marauding gangs, homes being broken into, machete attacks, all that sort of stuff. I mean, once you start taking down this imagery in the church, and I said last night, you know, I've still got a lot to think about on this issue. It's a really challenging one. But once you start taking down that vision out of Western Sydney, what do you do about all the other stuff we normally run in a news program like this?
Well, this is worse, and we wouldn't get away with running it. I mean, if you've seen it, it's a lot worse
we have showed the still. Yeah, no, I've seen it.
Yeah, we've shown the still, but we've shown the still. We haven't seen the guy getting stabbed, Peter. I mean, it's shocking. And look, I understand what you're saying, and it's basically, I think what you're saying is at the thin end of the wedge. Is it a fine line? Well, it is kind of a fine line, but we have to adhere to standards. So why shouldn't Twitter as a publisher? That would be my argument. If it was seeking to stop something which was about a political debate, I think I'd have a different view on this. But, you know, I mean, we don't show child abuse images.
What about...
Twitter shouldn't be able to show that either. And you know, it goes to that sort of thing. There are some things that need to be restricted.
As I said last night, Andrew, I'm a conservative before I'm a libertarian. But what about, say, the hate preachers? What about the hate preachers that arguably, if not in this case, certainly in plenty of other cases, incite young people, radicalise young people into doing a pretty heinous acts of terror?
Well, that is down to the e-safety commissioner. I mean, that I guess you're presenting a criticism of the way they're doing that role, and I'm open to that debate, but I haven't studied it, I must admit.
Yeah, I just note the Prime Minister says that videos like that are inflaming tensions in Western Sydney, cultural and racial tensions, but I just got to wonder why only one video comes down and a lot of that other filth up there is still there. Last night we talked about these polls. News poll, obviously, Resolve. I think we're all agreed now they're in trend. You and I often talk about the fact that the government now for 6 months has really settled into a position where at the next election, unless things change, they're in minority government. David Crowe in the Sydney Morning Herald today has a good look at all of that. He looks at the issues where the coalition's ahead, the economy. I think we both agree that's front and centre in the campaign, national security, immigration, detainees. And he says that Dutton's gained ground, even though he hasn't really got an answer for any of these things yet, but he's made ground up on the government, and he said you would be wrong to dismiss this trend if you are Labor. So this budget is incredibly important. Do you think there are alarm bells ringing inside Labor?
No, I don't, in terms of the budget. So I think I think Jim Chalmers wants his surplus. And he's got an economic argument on that. You can say it's deflationary, but you have to wonder how much of the ghost of Wayne Swan is about that, because to most Australians give a stuff about a surplus. And the other argument, of course, that we hear is, well, if you put too much assistance in, then you can fuel inflation. But you could look at something like petrol excise. There are things that you can look at, Peter. And so I think this is a dangerous period for the government, no question about it. I mean, it would be difficult to see the government in a good position in the polls when we've had whatever we've had, 12 rate rises, and we've had rents go up astronomically. But one lever they have, which they haven't yet, which they're promising to tackle on that front and haven't yet, is immigration. We know that. We've discussed that before. So it'd be very interesting to see what they do on that in the next 6 months, because that really feeds into why our housing costs, which is one of the worst ways the cost of living is going up. I don't see anything in this budget that will be a headline in terms of cost of living assistance unless Jim Chalmers and Anthony Albanese change their mind in the next 2 weeks. My understanding is the plan is to sell the stage 3 tax cuts, which we've known about the way they were rejigged since January. So I think the budget will go down like a lead balloon. Having said that, there's a long way to go. Will there be rate cuts? Well, there's concerns on that front for the government that they won't happen later this year. I think the opposition is not in an election winning position either. And I think where we are at the moment is, as you say, a minority government, but I still think it's possible for Labor to sneak into majority. But unquestionably, it is looking at the moment like a good result for independents and perhaps the Greens.
Well, just on that,
and that spells trouble for both major parties, and that's when they're not happy. The voters aren't happy with either alternative.
Look, I agree with that in part. In part, depends where some of those minor parties on the right sit in particular seats. But David Pocock, Jackie Lambie, you talk about crossbench independents. They were out there today. They want changes to negative gearing. They say they want people to only be able to own one investment property. They want to go after the capital gains tax discount people have when they sell a home. Now, they're influential. Labor needs them 9 times out of 10 to pass legislation. This cost Bill Shorten the unlosable election in 2019. Jackie Lambie says, look, people don't care about negative gearing anymore. What do you think?
Well, they definitely do care about negative gearing, and polling shows they don't want it altered. But I must say, Peter, I've long been of the view that if there is one way you could alter it, it's to allow people to have one property negatively geared, but not more. And in that sense, you're helping mum and dad investors, you're helping young people who can't afford to live in the area they want, so they buy something out in the bush or whatever, and at least get some wealth that way, rather than not allowing them to have negative gearing. But I don't think the government will go there. I understand what you're saying. They need those numbers in the Senate, but they are pretty polling driven, as all these guys are, and that polling shows it's poison to touch it, even if Jim Chalmers might privately want to.
We'll see. Andrew, thank you as always. All right, a major update today on plans for a second drug injecting room in the Melbourne CBD, as recommended in a report from former Police Commissioner Ken Lay, but belatedly released this week after more than a year.
We have been unable to find a location that strikes the right balance between supporting people who use drugs with the needs of the broader community. And that is why a second injecting service in the CBD is not our plan, and it won't be proceeding.
All right, let's pull apart the spin for some substance now. I'm joined by Victoria's Shadow Minister for Health, Georgie Crozier. Georgie, this report from Ken Lay took 10 years to turn up with the government. Close to $400,000 was spent. The number one recommendation was for a second injecting room, this time in the Melbourne CBD. Do you agree with it being axed?
Well, Peter, as you said, Ken Lay was commissioned 4 years ago to look into this issue around a second injecting room into the CBD. We've always opposed an injecting room to be in the CBD, and 4 years later, the government has finally come out and said there won't be one to proceed. But it doesn't take away from the fact that it's a long overdue decision that I'm sure the residents and businesses will welcome. But it doesn't take away from the fact that the government has been failing in delivering real meaningful drug and rehabilitation services in Victoria.
I've got a question, Georgie, and you've got a long history here about whether we can trust the Labor government, because they said before an election that they'd never have a drug injecting room in Victoria. They did not support one. Straight after they won the election, they started a trial, they call it, and then that trial became the permanent facility in Richmond. The Victorian Mental Health Minister, and she will have carriage of this new facility they're going to build down there. They're saying it's not an injecting room, it's a health centre. Her name's Ingrid Stitt. Well, she was on radio this afternoon on 3AW. She was asked about a hydromorphone. This is a replacement for heroin. She asked questions about that. Would it be injected in this new health hub? And here's the response.
Yes, it will be medically supervised and it is injected. There are some oral supplements that are taken as part of these sorts of trials. But as I said, it is a Victoria first.
So my fear here, Georgie, I mean, this will be injecting drugs. Yes, there'll be, government doctors prescribed drugs, not illicit drugs, but they'll still be, mind-altering drugs. this will be a drug injecting room by stealth. I bet you we all accept it won't happen. They'll start this, it'll be a trial, and we'll go down the path of what happened in Richmond. Are they softening us up, or do you really believe there will not be one in the CBD?
No, you've got every right to be cynical, Peter. I mean, as you said, they said no injecting room, and then we've got an injecting room. They said no ice in the injecting room, and we've got ice in the North Richmond injecting room. And quite frankly, the residents of North Richmond should be really furious that the Premier came out and said the community didn't want it in the CBD. Well, those residents don't want that injecting room next to a primary school either. So you've got every right to be cynical about the government's motives. Can I just say a bit about hydromorphone? It was actually our policy also to not only increase the numbers of rehabilitation beds across the state. We're way behind New South Wales. We said we needed 180 rehabilitation and treatment beds, withdrawal beds across the state. But hydromorphone is a last line treatment when methadone fails. And we suggested in the lead up to the last election that it be very heavily supervised co-located in a hospital where you've got medical supervision, and I mean it's a TGA approved drug, so it can be prescribed, but it needs to be carefully supervised. And I'm concerned about how the government will roll out their program in Flinders Street at the Uralla building that they bought for $40-odd million. So I think you've got every right to be cynical about what's going to proceed here. And of course, there are obviously businesses and residents are welcoming the announcement, but there is still concern around what the government will proceed with down the track.
Devil's in the detail, and of course there's an election for the Melbourne City Council, and I sort of worry that this is done deliberately to assist those running for the council elections, and they'll do whatever they like afterwards. Georgie Crozier, thanks as always. Great to have your company. We saw a lot of Georgie, didn't we, during the pandemic period. She's terrific, former nurse too, so she knows what she's talking about in this front. All right, after the break, a fired-up Veterans Shadow Minister Barnaby Joyce over the left's new attack on Anzac Day. Plus, live to Senator Jacinta Price on the ground in remote South Australia as communities demand a solution after Labor scrapped the cashless debit card. Coming up soon, one of your favourites, Jacinta Nampijinpa Price. She's been out bush. She's had a look at what's happened after that cashless debit card was scrapped. She's pretty fired up too, but so is my next guest. I want to return to the confected outrage from the left that now seems to accompany days of national observance. First, it was Australia Day, and now a day I arguably find more important to our country's sense of self, Anzac Day, is under attack. The latest nonsense comes from a group of pro-Palestinian teachers who, in their words, are pushing for the Anzac legend to be dismantled, somehow trying to draw a connection between our Anzacs and the current situation in Gaza. Joining me now, Shadow Veterans Affairs Minister Barnaby Joyce. Well, thank you, Barnaby, for your time. This group of teachers, they've got a 40-page document. Worryingly, they're involved with hundreds of schools across Australia. So we can't just dismiss this as fringe nonsense anymore, can we?
No, we can't, and they've gone out of their way to actually make sure that this makes the national news. And so we have to deal with it. This group, Teachers and Staff for Palestinians, and I'm sure there's a lot of people on the Palestinian issue who would be furious beyond belief that they have been sullied by being dragged into such a ridiculous position, such a contemptible position, that we would attack Anzac Day. Anzac Day is about the families of honour and all Australians who reflect and commemorate and say thank you to those who've offered their lives for the protection of our nation. Those who died, those who got maimed, those who were psychologically disturbed, those marriages and relationships that broke up because people are away, those careers that are lost. There is so much of a sacrifice that is part and parcel of the reason we have these liberties, these freedoms that allow the so-called Palestinian and staff, or teachers and staff for Palestinians, to go into the paper and say what they do. In another nation, they'd probably be in all sorts of strife, wouldn't they? But we have protected their right. Yet I think it comes from a form of quid pro quo, and what they are doing is dismantling I would say the centre of the Australian psyche, and if we don't jump on it straight away, they'll get away with it, just like they do with trying to get rid of Australia Day, just like they do trying to get rid of Christianity, just like they do trying to, piece by piece, disarticulates Australia from what it was to turn it into what they wish it to be.
Yeah, but the fish rots from the head, Barnaby. I mean, you know, these are a group of activist teachers, but you've got the Prime Minister who has changed policy in Canberra to allow 350,000 odd public servants to say, look, I don't want to commemorate war. I want nothing to do with Anzac Day. I'll take, a Tuesday off in a few months' time and I'll work Anzac Day. Now, I think you're the first one to jump on this issue. We saw it with Australia Day. But God help us, if we're now in the position where public servants at a Commonwealth level don't observe Anzac Day, well, why would anyone? That's the problem, that the Prime Minister's signal, a message that's being sent out.
Well, you're right, Peter. I mean, they've said, oh, well, you brought it about. We found the mistake and corrected it. They are very aware of this issue and they go on with it. So therefore they condone it. That means, because Anzac Day is on a Thursday, we'll have a lot of people say, well, I'll work Anzac Day even though I don't have to. I'm not with the RSL, I'm not a doctor or a nurse that has to work, but I'll go to work so I can go surfing on Friday, have a long weekend, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, beauty. But does that respect the people who, as I said, lay down their lives for our nation, that has the families who have given up so much? Is that respectful of it? No, it's not. And Mr Albanese and Mr Keogh know this, and they haven't fixed it. Just like now, Mr Albanese knows about the teachers and staff for Palestinians. Now, it's incumbent upon him to come out and say something about this. But Mr Albanese, he didn't even... The Minister for Veteran Affairs is not in the Cabinet, and as you know, Peter, if you're not in the Cabinet, you're just not in the room, are you? And things don't get heard. But this is just a whole litany of things that they're doing, which it's either clumsy or it's actually purposeful, that they're watering down the seminal day of the soul of our nation, which is Anzac Day. It really is. It doesn't matter what colour, what creed you are. If you live in this nation and benefit from the freedoms of this nation, then you better respect the people who fought and died or maimed or families got turned upside down for your right to live the life you live.
Beautifully said, Barnaby. Thank you for your time. Now, look, I want to return to the issue of the cashless debit card and the issues that remote communities have faced since Labor foolishly abolished the card almost as soon as they got into power. Joining me now, Shadow Indigenous Affairs Minister Jacinta Nampijinpa Price. Well, great to have your company again, Jacinta. I sort of miss you after you won the Voice and defeated that referendum. I know you've been busy on the ground back in your portfolio. You and Senator Karen Little, you've been on the ground in Ceduna in South Australia. This was one of the areas that had the card, it was taken away from them, and there's now been an increase in violence since it was scrapped. What are you hearing from locals?
Yeah, Peter, locals are beside themselves. While there were those that had suggested that perhaps it wasn't particularly working at the time, since it's been removed, they absolutely see the difference in their community. The way in which people have been taking advantage of the fact that they can, get access to alcohol quite regularly. They've got a lot more money in their pocket to spend on alcohol. There are those that might have had a big, long night on the drink and then they can go to Salvos the next day, wait for them to open up, hand over their clothes to be washed and folded for them and sleep off the night before, have something to eat and then do it all again the next day. But the worst part about it is that it's affecting children once again, our most vulnerable, people who now can put their money in the poker machine slots. And there's an increase, of course, in domestic and family violence, as we know. And, for the life of me, we don't, and the locals don't understand why the government, the Albanese government, decided to make this decision based on academics from the inner city who are far removed from communities like Ceduna.
Yeah, the whole fight about the Voice was the Prime Minister saying this would give us people to listen to who knew about the issues on the ground. I don't think he's been to Ceduna in recent times. I don't get a sense, after he lost his voice, the Voice referendum, that he's even got back into any of these issues. He all tea and sympathy last year. We haven't seen action on the ground in relation to Aboriginal affairs. And as taxpayers, we give people money, welfare money, because we want them to use it to support the children in their lives. Roof overhead, food on the table, clothes for school. That's where these kids are being hurt right now.
That's exactly right, Peter. And this just demonstrates the absolute arrogance and the ignorance of this Prime Minister. One, to do this in the first place to the most vulnerable people in these communities, but two, that he went ahead with a referendum and a voice that he must have thought he was going to get over the line, that he thought was going to be the magic wand to solve these problems, but that he did not have any plan whatsoever to address any of these issues after this failed referendum. And people are trying to pick up the pieces, and service providers in these communities are absolutely under the pump. We've got local businesses from the community who are beside themselves, and they're all threatening, just like Alice Springs, to leave the community because of the amount of crime that they're now confronted with. And they're talking about applying more alcohol restrictions in Ceduna. Well, a place, is going through a crisis when you have to start thinking of using those sorts of measures. And this was a tool in the first place to limit access to alcohol in the first place for those that are afflicted by alcohol and substance abuse.
Jacinta Price, thank you for your time. Great to see you. Keep up the fight. We'll catch up soon. Right, just before we hit the break, Libby Mettam, she's a West Australian Liberal leader. She has declared the Liberal Party will ban the use of puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones and surgical intervention for children under the age of 16. Now, she has acknowledged this all comes in the wake of that landmark report from the UK, the Cass Review. And I can only hope this starts a decent conversation right across Australia, that we adopt a similar stand from the UK and now in WA across the board. After the break, Chris Uhlmann joins me for a misinformation campaign that appears to be run right out of the Russian embassy in Sydney. More on that soon. Welcome back. I now want to return to an important issue that's come to light in and around the horrific knife attack in Bondi, and the impact too of social media, where opportunists are able to seize and promote outright lies. In the immediate aftermath of the attack, Channel 7 wrongly broadcast the name of an innocent man, Benjamin Cohen, for which he's now begun defamation proceedings. What's interesting, though, is where this all started and why it points to something much more malicious than just a major news blunder. Cohen's name was in fact largely spread by social media pro-Putin influencer Simeon Boykov, commonly known as Aussie Cossack, who posted that there are unconfirmed reports, he said, that Cohen was the attacker. Now, of course, Cohen was not the attacker, but it didn't take long for Twitter to run with the accusations. And this chart shows just how many times that tweet was viewed. Joining me now to discuss why this is so chilling, Sky News contributor Chris Uhlmann. Well, Chris, where this gets really interesting is this bloke, Aussie Cossack, has been hiding in the Russian consulate in Sydney. He's wanted on assault charges. This has got a lot more about it, isn't it, than a case of mistaken identity?
Well, Peter, this is what information warfare looks like, a deliberate attempt to sow discord, to undermine our democracy by spreading lies from someone who is hiding out in the Russian embassy, as you say, the Russian consulate in Sydney. And are we to believe that if he wasn't acting on the behalf of the Russian government, that he would be in that embassy for 1 minute longer? No, he'd be punted into the street. So this is done at the behest of a foreign government, and this is clearly an act of aggression. What happened online was that rumour that was going around wasn't going anywhere until it hit his account, and then it got 400,000 views, and then eventually got rebroadcast on Channel 7. Now, What happened on Channel 7 is up to Channel 7, but what happened in the Russian embassy is a matter for all of us, and this is just the stuff that we can see. But I can't see a more clear-cut case of foreign interference, because to do foreign interference now, it's against the law, it's to act on behalf of a foreign principle, and one of the things that the law provides for is that someone who is threatening our national security. Now, I suggest that's precisely what happened, and perhaps adding to the assault charge should be a charge of foreign interference, and that carries a 20-year jail sentence. And if the Russian government doesn't believe that he has a case to answer, then they can send him into the street and see how he's dealt with.
We know that Russia is one of those state actors that uses bots and trolls and non-human people, I guess, armies of cyber warriors to promulgate things on social media, to get them to take off. Now, that could be what happened here, we don't know. But he is inside the Russian embassy. He's been given comfort from Russia. Where are the questions from the government about this issue?
I think there are big questions to be answered, and the government should be asking them. He, by the way, was given Russian citizenship by presidential decree, which shows just how important he apparently is to the Russian government. And I'm not a lawyer, I don't know. Maybe there is no case to answer under foreign interference, but this is clearly an act of aggression by the Russian government on our shores. And maybe it is time to look at the number of people who are in the Russian embassy here in Canberra and the consulate in Sydney, and given everything that's happening, punt one or two of them. Now, I know that in the end that means that there will be a reciprocal effect in Russia, but I think that certainly that a strong message needs to be sent that this is entirely unacceptable, and this is just the stuff that we can see.
Mike Pizzullo, he's the former Home Affairs Secretary, formerly a Labor staffer, worked for Kim Beazley, I knew him way back then. He then runs the whole Home Affairs Department. He is removed over allegations, or sorry, I think it was a finding in the end that he broke the code, public service code. But what's interesting, he's written for The Australian, and in what he has written, Chris, he talks about information warfare. This is a really salient example of what he knows from the inside and it's put out there in the public domain. Two questions here. I mean, what did you think of Pizzullo more broadly? I think, he's been in this space, this defence, national security space for some time. He's really, I think, belling the cat here to say we've got to take this stuff seriously. And something else, but I'll come to it. What's your response on that?
Yeah, look, Mike Pizzullo is a polarising character. He said himself that he made a mistake, and there are many people in Canberra who loathe him and many people in Canberra who love him. But he was a person who gave frank and fearless advice to government, and even his greatest critics would say he was a great strategic thinker. And I think he is missed from the public service, where there are so few of those kinds of characters. I think it would be churlish to remove his AO, and I hope that the government doesn't do that, because he did give great service to Australia. He made a mistake, and I saw him on 7:30 last night, and I thought that he handled himself with great dignity. And you know the thing that he did do that I thought was really interesting? He admitted that he'd made a mistake. He thanked the person who had investigated him and said that she had been fair, and he did it all with great dignity. Now, that's not something you see a lot of in public life these days.
Look, I reckon he was one of the best I ever saw around the national security table, and I have to say I'd feel a bit better off at the moment, given the issues with our borders and Islamists in our midst, if he was back in his old job. A whole lot of those positions, AFP, ASIO, I think ASIS as well, they're all up for renewal, or they could be shown the door. That's a lot of change for the government at a time when the ministers in those portfolios are certainly not performing as best they should. Should they roll some of these people over, do you think?
Oh, look, I think that we are really well served by our national security agencies. I completely disagree with Paul Keating and his assessment of the people who are in those jobs. They have done great work for us, but the establishment is back in charge in Canberra now. Foreign Affairs taking over again, Prime Minister and Cabinet. They're cleaning house, waiting for the arrival of the Premier of China. They don't want anyone talking about that kind of stuff. So the national security heads have been muted, I think, a little bit of recent times. I think we've got really good people in those jobs. I hope the government hangs on to them, but of course, me backing them probably doesn't help, so I should stop, Peter.
I better not back them either. That's a short, fast way to get them thrown out.
That would be even worse.
Chris, thank you as always. It would be worse. Thank you for your time. See you next week. All right, after the break, we're going to get into these issues over the United States. This Chinese company, it's leaving taxpayers on the hook for millions. We've got the Columbia, we'll have to call them riots at the universities. Those protests are absolutely shocking against Jewish students. And all the latest on Trump out of the US. Welcome back. Let's bring in my panel now. Joining me for their take on international stories, Sky News contributor Kosha Garda and the Senior Fellow of Menzies Research Centre. I nearly said the Institute there, Nick. I'm on the board of the Institute. You're on the Research Centre. Nick Cater, of course. Let's start with revelations that we are, as taxpayers, Nick, putting in millions and millions of dollars to a Chinese construction company that's working on overhauling the big airport in Nauru, or the port, beg your pardon, in Nauru. Now, I know why we're doing this. We want to limit China's influence in the region. But I've got to wonder whether this is a poor deal for taxpayers, because we're spending all this money buying infrastructure to keep out China in foreign countries. I mean, aid used to be about food, water, education, all the sort of basics. Now we're trying to outbid China everywhere in the South Pacific.
Well, that's right, Peter, and it's something very half-baked about it, isn't it? I mean, I think we do need to focus much more on our region. I mean, that's obvious. The amount of time, the amount of money, the amount of resources China is putting into gaining influence in our region is truly alarming. We have to counter that in some way. Do we counter it by paying a Chinese company to do some construction work? You know, for goodness sake, if this infrastructure is so important it needs to be done, can't we spend our own aid money on perhaps an Australian company running this project and possibly employing some local people? I think it looks like everything at the moment to do with our Pacific policy. It looks amateur hour, and we're not facing up to the seriousness of the situation and taking this really in a very concerted and serious way.
Kosha, what's going on at Columbia University? I mean, it has gone around the world. Ayan Hirsi Ali, human rights activist, we know her well. She's put a post out on X. She says, for a second, imagine that black students at Columbia were taunted, go back to Africa. Or imagine that a gay student was surrounded by homophobic protesters and hit with a stick at Yale. But that's what's happening to Jews, isn't it?
It is. It's quite a stunning picture. I think Columbia has become sort of ground zero for this, but it's spreading out elsewhere at Yale, at NYU, et cetera. There's basically about 200 protesters that have formed this encampment at Columbia outside the West Lawn. About half of them, 108 of them, were arrested for trespassing without incident, and 2 of them for obstruction of government administration, one of whom actually is the daughter of sitting Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. So that sort of, makes this issue spill out into the political arena even further. In terms of why it's happening, I mean, we've talked about this before, that there's so many dynamics that are almost like a petri dish at these universities over there, where there's the impact of immigration and importing some of these allegiances that are spilling out. There's sort of this coddling culture that's happened at these universities. There's the way protests, I think, were amplified and supported during the summer riots with BLM. I think that culture is carrying over, and you just have weak leadership at the top of the university, and all those things put together is leading to some pretty stunning and outrageous stuff that we're seeing.
Hey, Nick, over in the UK, we've talked about the Hillary Cass report, where she's debunked a lot of these gender affirmation treatments. She says they're not looking after young people. She has now been unable, basically, to get out in public. She can't use public transport. She's got difficulty leaving her home, all because she conducted a thorough medical review of the so-called trans science. J.K. Rowling, of course, out there defending her. But this is shocking.
It's absolutely shocking, Peter. And what we're up against here is a very, very organised, ideologically driven transgender movement in working in concert with people with a huge financial interest in this. There's a whole new school of medicine and surgery, which and pharmaceuticals for that matter, that are making a killing out of promoting the transgender amongst children. Now, that's when you get the powerful combination of ideologues and people who can make a buck out of it. That's when you get this really vicious cancel culture and everything that goes with it. I mean, we saw the same with COVID, and we see the same, of course, every day with climate change. That's what we've got here, and we have to really break this because it's, you know, we know what this is doing to our teenage kids, and we know what it's doing to our society.
Spot on, Nick Cato. Kosher, what's the latest in the Donald Trump hush money trial?
So the trial has officially commenced. Opening statements have been made, and all eyes are on what the impact of this is going to be on the election, really. And we just don't know because it's never happened in the history of the Republic. There's two dynamics where either it's galvanizing people who just see this as a show trial and a bastardization of the legal system, or it's going to make Trump a little bit untouchable to some of those folks who just won't be able to vote for a convicted felon. That's going to run its course, and we'll see how it unfolds before November.
And it's running on every news bureau across the country, so it's free advertising for him if you're listening, or if you've had enough. Well, maybe you're not. Nick and Kosher, thank you very much for your time. Geez, it's going to be interesting the next few months ahead. That's it for me. See you tomorrow night. Here's Andrew Bolt.